Let's take a walk down the street and have a talk. Thank you for listening, by the way. Fear, anguish, depression, isolation, sickness, death, worthlessness, imprisonment, hate. At some point in our lives, we experience these emotions: happiness, joy, connection, healthy, living, unfettered, worth, free, love. At some point in our lives, we experience these emotions. We all have depended on another at some point in our lives. Even the most so-called independent stoic has depended on another. Each individual wants their own agency and strives to be independent of others. Despite this, there comes a time where you will need somebody. This is called the human condition. Let's roll back and walk the street in 1867. Place, San Francisco, California. Problem, an influx of a certain kind of individual who San Francisco deemed unsightly. This included soldiers who had emerged from the Civil War disabled and unable to work, immigrants, the unemployed and penniless from the gold rush and other local happenings, the disabled, the poor, the marginalized, children of the poor, disabled, and marginalized, disabled children. Solution: the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed an order then called the Unsightly Beggars Law. It was later retroactively renamed the Ugly Law. Remember the name of this board for later. The Ugly Law made it illegal for any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object to expose himself or herself to public view. At the time of San Francisco passing this, it was a subset under the main law, the Unsightly Beggars Law. This part of the law reads as follows: no person shall either directly or indirectly, whether by look, word, sign, or deed, practice begging or mendicancy in any public place. The culture then, as it is to some degree today, was that any sign of disability should be hidden from public sight. With the way this law was worded and organized, a person who met any of these requirements could be arrested, whether or not they were begging. This means if a man with cerebral palsy in a wheelchair joined a friend for dinner at a restaurant, another person in the public building could request the police to have this person arrested under the Ugly Law. This means if a person who is transgender is enjoying an outdoor public concert in the park, they could be arrested under the Ugly Law. This means if a person of color was simply tying their shoes on a public sidewalk, another person could get them arrested under the Ugly Law. This means if a person who is poor and not dressed well was taking a break sitting down on the curb of the street, could be arrested under the Ugly Law. This means a child who may have belonged to any number of these people would also be taken in with them. This law was used to arrest those who were begging and those who were not begging. What happened after the arrest? People were fined and jailed until an almshouse or a work farm could be available. Almshouse, also known as poorhouses, were houses constructed by charitable organizations or individuals for poor people who could not work. Work farms were places people were sent to do manual labor, and they were also kept confined like prisoners. Once a person arrives at the almshouse, they are further broken down and dehumanized according to each establishment's particular policies. Susan M. Schweik, author of The History of Disability, The Ugly Laws, in the chapter titled Producing the Unsightly, on page 28, she writes, for instance, according to whether one was, quotes, copper in the color coding of the city's almshouse records, or, quotes, coolie, or, quotes, native born white, made a difference in the sorting, determining how someone found to be a certain person in San Francisco would be defined as infirm or disgustingly diseased, construed as pitiable or deplorable, and disposed of in jail or in quarantine or exile or given over to the harsh charity of the almshouse. Cities across America started implementing ugly laws. A law that started in San Francisco, California in 1867 didn't end until 1974, with Chicago being the last to repeal its law. This was also the same year that the last person was arrested under the ugly law. To add perspective, on December 7th, 1974, the Rehabilitation Act amendments amended the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 by expanding the definition of handicapped individual. What is the significance of this? What is the application of this? The significance is this. Anybody that was different, for example, disabled, color, sexual orientation, could be arrested. Even having a scar on your face could have had you hauled in under the ugly law. Remember that I had said that the last person to be arrested under the ugly law was in 1974? This was the year an Oklahoma officer was looking to arrest a homeless man. This homeless man had scars on his face and body. The officer used the fact that this man had scars on his face and body to arrest him under the ugly law. The judge in this case dismissed the charges, saying, "Who defines ugly?" Let's start with the basic rights that were yanked from these individuals. Further laws were made to ensure all individuals qualified under these definitions could not reproduce. This means people of different sexual orientation, disabled individuals, immigrants, poor people, and people of different ethnicities had their reproductive rights revoked and were imprisoned in horrific almshouse and work farm conditions. These people were prevented from marrying and from being in public places. Yet these same people were allowed to be in public if it was for entertainment. P.T. Barnum is an example of this. The cultural makeup and the social climate towards these people dehumanized them. It claimed them unworthy. It is all found in the wording of its laws and in the words used to refer to them. These laws called them people, which implies a wholeness. It also fully entitled them to their rights, while at the same time regulating them as beneath humans, describing them as unsightly, horrid, etc. Susan M. Schweik, author of The Ugly Laws, Disability in Public, and Chapter 4, titled The Law and Language, best describes the end result of these detrimental laws. Consider, for instance, the ordinance's relation to what Casson calls the dialectics of social classification, the emerging standards of rudeness and refinement, acceptable and unacceptable, appearance and behavior in the late 19th century United States, Casson shows how, within the proximate spaces of the new American metropolis, evolving codes of civility help to implant a new, more problematic sense of identity, externally cool and controlled, internally anxious and conflicted, and of social relationships. In the anonymous metropolis and within a market economy, individuals grew accustomed to offering themselves for public appraisal. At the same time, they scrutinized others to guard against social counterfeits. Earlier, I asked you to remember the name of that board, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Remember? The ones who started the first ugly law. Susan Schweik writes, the same board that set this ugly law in motion simultaneously and subsequently engaged in a wide variety of racialized public health intrusions against the Chinese in particular. These orders, which pathologized Chinese people as inherently diseased, maimed, deformed, defective, and infective, profoundly shaped the city space of San Francisco. In the context of measures like the mass quarantines of entire and entirely Chinese districts of the city, ostensibly to halt epidemics of infectious disease, ugly law may be understood as an interlocked attempt to map and contain deviance. Sanda Friedman writes in her book, Discrimination Law, individuals with disabilities are a discrete and insular minority who have been faced with restrictions and limitations, subjected to a history of purposeful unequal treatment, and regulated to a position of political powerlessness in our society based on characteristics that are beyond the control of such individuals and resulting from stereotypic assumptions not truly indicative of the individual ability of such individuals to participate in and contribute to society. Fear, anguish, depression, isolation, sickness, death, worthlessness, imprisonment, hate. At some point in our lives, we experience these emotions: happiness, joy, connection, healthy, living, unfettered, worth, free, love. At some point in our lives, we experience these emotions. We all have depended on another at some point in our lives. Even the most so-called independent stoic has depended on another. Each individual wants their own agency and strives to be independent of others. Despite this, there comes a time where you will need somebody. This is called the human condition. This is why words matter.